The government of Alberta has been in the news a lot lately, whether it be the Premier's close ties to MAGA Republicans, the healthcare scandal, where a number of members of the government have been accused of corruption, or more recently, their campaign to introduce a referendum on separating from Canada. While all of that was dominating the news cycle, the government did something quietly. They transferred over 700 structures and 380 land titles, worth over $13 billion, occupied by hospitals, long-term care facilities, and other healthcare adjacent buildings, from the ownership of separate nonprofit organizations into the hands of the government. How they did this, and if it's even legal, is one question. The other is what the government intends to do with those properties and what that means for healthcare in Alberta. Was this transfer simply, as the government says, a way to consolidate ownership of healthcare facilities under one umbrella in order to operate more efficiently? Or, as critics say, is this another case of the UCP government working towards privatizing healthcare in order to create big profits for private corporations? To understand this whole situation, we have to briefly understand the structure of Alberta Health Services, or AHS, and the Alberta government. Simply, Alberta Health Services is a quasi-independent agency that's funded by the Alberta government. AHS, until April 1st, when the government took control of the buildings, owned about $13 billion in healthcare-related properties. Those buildings are an expense of the Alberta government as they fund AHS. As a nonprofit organization, individuals can donate to the properties owned by AHS. For example, if someone wanted to donate a wing to a hospital. Why does that matter? Private citizens have made large donations to publicly owned institutions owned by AHS, which have significantly increased their value. AHS has reported income of over $5 billion since 2020, not from the Alberta government. That'll be relevant in a minute. Since Danielle Smith became Premier, she's worked to add more private organizations into healthcare, the most public face of this being private surgical clinics. It's long been one of her priorities to dismantle AHS and separate it into 4 smaller organizations that manage parts of Alberta's healthcare, under the umbrella of a new government organization called Acute Care. We have a separate video on this, but the situation surrounding AHS has a lot to do with this land grab. On January 8, 2025, Athana Mentzelopoulos was fired from her position as the CEO of AHS by the government. Mentzelopoulos alleges it was because she was looking into what became the corrupt care scandal, basically the government giving overpriced procurement contracts to unqualified organizations with connections to the government. At the same time, Mentzelopoulos alleges that Health Minister Adriana Lagrange was attempting to take decision-making power away from AHS, which Mentzelopoulos resisted. After Mentzelopoulos was fired, the government also dismissed the board of AHS and appointed Andre Tremblay, the Deputy Minister of Health, as AHS's new CEO and one-man board of directors, a position he held while also briefly being Deputy Minister of Health. And we see the conflict of interest here. AHS and the Alberta government are supposed to work collaboratively. The Minister of Health delivers the general vision for healthcare, and a qualified CEO and board of directors at AHS determines how best to steward public funds in order to carry out the government's overall objectives. Now, the government has placed a loyalist in sole charge of AHS. They passed a new bylaw stating that AHS could not appoint anyone else to the role of president CEO or to the board of directors other than Tremblay for the remainder of the winding up period, which essentially means until the Alberta government dissolves AHS and puts them under the management of Acute Care Alberta. So simply, the Alberta government is in the process of dismantling AHS and in the meantime has put AHS under the control of someone who is fairly certain to follow the orders of Health Minister Adriana Lagrange. The government was not likely to leave a shadow organization like that in control of all that property, but they needed a mechanism by which to take the property without purchasing it, as the Alberta government is running a huge deficit. Well, in 2024, the Alberta government passed the Real Property Governance Act, or the RPG Act. Its purpose was to do 2 main things. 1, to give the government a clear, centralized inventory of public property so they could better manage those assets. The second was to give the government the first right of refusal if any publicly funded agency decided to get rid of a property. Basically, if an agency wanted to sell a property, the government held the right to buy it from them first. This bill was authored by previous Minister of Infrastructure Peter Guthrie, who resigned from his position due to the allegations against the Alberta government surrounding the corrupt care scandal. Now, maybe a legal scholar smarter than I can tell me I'm wrong here, but nowhere in the Act, as far as I can tell, is the government given the ability to simply take land. The Act states that, quote, where a department or consolidated entity no longer uses any real property for any specific program or determines any real property to be surplus, the department or consolidated entity, prior to any sale, disposition, or transfer of the real property to any other person, end quote, shall essentially give the government the option to buy it at fair market value. But AHS was using these properties. Those properties are occupied by hospitals and long-term care homes and hundreds of other healthcare buildings. And the government didn't pay AHS a cent, they simply transferred ownership. One might call that expropriation, except the government has specified in Section 8 of the Act that, quote, nothing in this Act or the regulations, and nothing done or omitted to be done in accordance with this Act or the regulations, constitutes an expropriation or injurious affection under the Expropriation Act or any other enactment or at common law. So if the law doesn't actually allow them to take the land, how did they do it? Quite simply, no one tried to stop them. The land grab is clearly not in the interest of AHS, but the timing, shortly after appointing a new CEO and board of AHS with loyalty to the health minister, meant that nobody within AHS was going to contradict the government or ask if what they were doing was even legal. Although it's questionable as to whether this would ever happen, if there is no challenge to this process, it could set a dangerous precedent. If the government is able to seize land from a separate but publicly funded organization, could they do the same with education or other public services? But you may ask, what is the issue with the government owning properties that they already pay for? Well, it comes down to what the government may choose to do with that land. Officially, the government has said they are simply going to lease the properties back to the organizations that already own them, at no cost, meaning no tangible change to how hospitals and other organizations are run. But many expect that to only be a temporary measure. Danielle Smith's government has already made significant strides into privatizing healthcare. The government now owns billions of dollars of property and are free to do what they want with them. The value of those properties has grown considerably due to charitable donations from private citizens, done at the time with the expectation that those institutions were publicly run. On May 1st, 2025, the UCP government introduced Bill 55, the Health Statutes Amendment Act, an act that is intended to allow changes to the oversight and governance of health foundations. Among the changes in the bill are amendments that would allow the health minister to designate new operators for approved public hospitals, including corporations. The government has already tried to privatize healthcare in a number of ways, every time at huge costs to taxpayers. Between 2022 and 2023 and 2023-24, the average cost of surgeries at for-profit chartered surgical facilities increased by 52%. In Alberta, an average hip surgery at a public institution costs about $4,000 for the Alberta taxpayer. At Alberta Surgical Group facilities, a private for-profit provider, they cost over $8,000. Danielle Smith's government has also hired private agencies to provide nurses. From April 2021 to April 2024, the cost of contract nurses in Alberta increased from $5 million to $150 million. These types of private services are also a key tool in union busting, allowing organizations to sometimes avoid collective bargaining agreements. In December 2022, just 2 months after Danielle Smith took over leadership of the UCP, the government handed a contract for medical lab testing to a private company called DynaLife, saying it would save tens of millions of dollars. 2 weeks before the contract was set to take effect, DynaLife said they needed more funding. Less than 3 months later, DynaLife said the company was insolvent and needed an additional $70 million. Eventually, they asked the province to buy DynaLife, which it did, for almost $100 million. The previous NDP government had a deal in place to buy DynaLife years earlier for only $70 million, something Jason Kenney's government canceled, concluding that private contracts would result in greater savings. This attempt at privatization not only cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars, but also increased wait times. Once the government absorbed DynaLife and the testing was taken over by AHS, wait times went back down. This does not mean necessarily that private healthcare within Canada's publicly funded system can't work. But in the case of healthcare, Danielle Smith's government has a list of scandals, nepotistic contracts, or instances of complete incompetence that are piling up. Now the government looks poised to accelerate those efforts, or at least lay the groundwork so they can do so when it's most advantageous. Alberta is running a $5.2 billion deficit, just as they are implementing a $1.2 billion income tax cut, a cut Smith campaigned on, then initially delayed until 2027 due to budgetary issues, then moved up to 2025 after complaints from UCP supporters. Not to mention that US tariffs will have significant impacts on Alberta's economy, as the vast majority of Alberta's oil exports go to the States. All of these things will only make the deficit worse for the cash-strapped government. Selling off healthcare assets not only aligns with the decisions the government has already made around healthcare, but could be one way for them to bring some money into the provincial coffers. For a government already embroiled in a number of healthcare scandals related to giving public contracts to questionable organizations with connections to the government, it would not be out of character for the UCP to give leases to friends who will maximize profit at the expense of taxpayers. For now, the UCP's land transfer is not being challenged in court, and it's likely it will stay that way. As the government overhauls the province's healthcare, the real question is who will benefit: Albertans or corporations and wealthy individuals? Only time will tell.